The dog had been carrying sticks to the north side of the cabin for 9 days before Hannah Vale stopped sweeping them away. She had thought, at first, that the animal was nesting or playing, or had developed some private grief of the kind dogs sometimes carry after a death in the house. Her husband had been dead 4 months. The dog had loved him. It seemed a reasonable thing for a creature to do, to gather sticks and lay them against a wall, the way a widow might gather memories and lay them against a Sunday. But on the 10th morning, she stood in the doorway, with her hand resting on the low shelf of her belly, and she watched the dog work. He was not playing. He was not grieving. He was choosing. He picked through the woodpile with a deliberateness she had only seen in men counting coins. He took the green sticks and left the dry ones. He took the curved branches and left the straight. He carried each one to the north wall of the cabin and laid it down at an angle, building something that was not a pile and not a nest, but a shape, with a notion behind it. His name was Crow, for the color of him, and he was the last living thing on the place that had known her husband's voice. It was the autumn of 1884. The cabin sat on a low rise above the Powder River in the Wyoming Territory, 8 miles from the town of Bitter Fork and a great deal further than that from anyone who might be called a friend. Hannah Vale was 26 years old and 7 months along with a child her husband would never see. The cabin was sawed over a timber frame, with a roof that had been patched twice and never properly, and a north wall that had been her husband's worry the whole of his last spring. She had buried him in June, beside the cottonwood. She had not gone into town since. Crow came back from the woodpile, with a length of willow in his jaws, dropped it against the wall, and looked at her. He had a way of looking that was not a dog's begging look but something older, something that asked a question without expecting an answer. His ears were the color of wet bark. His eyes were the color of the river in November. She came down from the doorway and walked, slow with the weight of the child, to the place where he had been working. She bent, with effort, and looked at what he had made. The sticks lay in a rough crescent against the foot of the north wall, 4 feet long and a foot deep, packed close against the sod. The arrangement was not random. The green sticks were on the outside. The dry sticks were within. The curved branches formed the outer rim, hollow side facing the wall, like the staves of a small and patient barrel. She did not understand it. She stood up, and the small life inside her shifted, and Crow watched her with that question in his eyes. And she understood only that he was not finished. She let him work. She had been raised by a father who held that animals were tools, and a mother who held that they were burdens, and she had married a man who held that they were neither, that a good dog was a kind of neighbor with better manners than most. Her husband had said once, over a winter supper, that Crow knew things he didn't have the words for. She had laughed. He had not. He had said it as a man says a thing he has thought about. She remembered that now, watching the dog at the north wall, in the town of Bitter Fork, 8 miles away, 2 men had already begun to talk about her. One was Reverend Pell, who held the small Methodist church on the square and who had ridden out twice since June to inquire after her soul. The second was a homesteader named Asa Trumbull, who held the section adjoining hers and who had ridden out once in July to inquire after her land. She had received both men on the porch and offered neither water. They had taken note of this. Men do. It was Trumbull who had seen the dog working at the north wall, on a day in late September when he had ridden up uninvited to ask whether she had reconsidered his offer for the lower quarter. He had watched the animal a long moment, and then he had laughed. Not a kind laugh, not a mean one, but the laugh a man uses to mark a thing he intends to repeat later. He had said, riding away, that the widow Vale had begun to take her instructions from a dog. The Reverend Pell, when the story reached him, had not laughed. He had pressed his lips together and said that grief did strange work on a woman alone, and that he would pray for her. The praying, in his telling, sounded like a threat. Both versions reached her, eventually, by way of a peddler who passed through on the road to the Tong. He told her, kindly, that she might want to come into town and show her face, lest people forget what she looked like and remember only what they had been told. She thanked him and gave him a jar of preserves and watched him ride on. That night, Crow lay down across the threshold of the cabin with his nose pointed north. He had not done that before. She watched him from the bed, by the light of a single tallow lamp, and she thought about the sticks against the wall, and she thought about her husband's last spring, and she thought about the child inside her, who turned, just then, as if listening. She slept poorly. She woke before dawn to the sound of the dog breathing at the door, slow and steady, like a man keeping watch. In the days that followed, she began to watch Crow the way her husband had taught her to read a fire, looking not at what was burning, but at what the flame was telling her about the wood. The dog was telling her something. She did not know yet what it was. But she began to follow him. He led her, first to the spring. The spring lay 40 yards east of the cabin, in a little draw shaded by chokecherry, and it had been her husband's pride. Clean water year-round, even in the worst of January. Crow went to it 3 times in a single morning. He did not drink. He sniffed the ground around it, and circled and put his nose against a particular stone at the spring's lip, and looked at her. She knelt, slowly, with one hand braced, and put her own hand on the stone. It was warmer than it should have been. She did not know what that meant. She filed it away. He led her, next, to the low ground south of the cabin, where the snow always drifted deepest in February. He walked the line of the drift as it would form, though there was no snow yet. Only the brown grass bent by the first frosts. He walked it twice, and then he sat down at the eastern end of where the drift would lie, and he waited. She came up behind him and looked along the line of his sight. She saw then what she had not seen in 3 years of living on the place, that the drift line ran exactly along a shallow swale, and that the swale ran exactly toward the north wall of the cabin, and that anything which built up in that swale would, in a hard wind, come piling against the wall the dog had been packing with sticks. She stood there a long time. The child shifted. The dog waited. She walked back to the cabin, and she looked at the north wall with new eyes. The sod was thin there. Her husband had known it. He had meant to dig a berm against it before winter, and had been carried off by a fever before he could lift the spade. She had not had the strength since. She had not had the strength for many things, but she had. She found the strength for this. That afternoon, she took the spade from the lean-to, and she went to the north wall, and she began to dig. She did not dig fast. She dug the way a pregnant woman digs, which is to say slowly, with frequent rests, with a hand pressed often to the small of her back. Crow watched her. When she paused, he came and laid his head against her knee. When she resumed, he moved off and lay down in the grass where he could see both her and the north horizon. She worked until dusk. She had moved perhaps 2 wheelbarrows of earth. That night, she sat at the small pine table with her husband's old almanac open before her, and she read by tallow light the entries he had made in the margins. He had been a man who wrote in books. He had written, beside the November pages, a single line in his cramped, careful hand. Watch the dog, watch the spring, watch the swale. She had read those words before. She had not understood them. She had thought in June that they were the mind of a sick man wandering. She closed the almanac, now, and she put her hand on its cover, and she sat for a long time without moving. Crow lay at her feet. The child turned. She wondered, in the dark, what else her husband had known that she had not yet learned to see. She would not know, until midnight on the 18th of November, just how much the work went on. Through the first week of October, she dug at the north wall by day and read the almanac by night, and Crow continued his own labor with the sticks. She came to understand, by watching him, that he was building a kind of windbreak, not against the cold itself, but against the specific shape of the wind that would come funneling down the swale from the north. The green sticks would not catch fire from a stray spark in the snow's reflection of a winter sun. The curved branches would not pack flat under the weight of drift. They would hold a hollow against the wall, a pocket of still air. She had read, somewhere in her husband's books, that dead air was the warmest blanket a man could buy. She had not understood it then. She understood it now. She began to add to the dog's work. She gathered chaff from the threshing floor of the small barn, the husks and broken straw her husband had saved for bedding, and she packed it into the spaces between Crow's sticks. He watched her do this and did not interfere. He seemed, if anything, satisfied. When she finished a section, he would walk along it, nose low, checking the work. Once he pulled a single stick free and laid it elsewhere. She replaced it where he had put it. A man named Holloway came by on the 8th of October. He was the closest neighbor she had, 3 miles down the river, and he had come, he said, to see if she needed anything from town before the weather turned. He was an older man, gentle in his way, but he saw the work at the north wall, and he stopped his horse, and he looked a long time. Then he said, careful, that he had never seen a cabin packed that way, and that he did not know what she was doing, but that he hoped she was sure of it. She told him she was not sure of anything. She told him the dog had started it. She told him she was finishing what the dog began. Holloway sat his horse and he looked at Crow, who looked back at him with that question in his eyes, and Holloway did not laugh. He did not laugh because he was an old man, and he had lived long enough to know that the things which keep a person alive in a hard country are not always the things a person can explain. He told her to send for him if she needed sending for, and he rode on. By the time he reached Bitter Fork that evening, the story had already gotten there ahead of him, in the telling of Asa Trumbull, who had ridden past her place that morning on his way to the land office. By the time Holloway tied his horse outside the general store, 3 men at the counter were already laughing about the widow who took orders from a dog. One of them said the dog had told her to dig a grave for itself, and she had misunderstood. The others laughed. Holloway did not. He bought his flour and his coffee, and he went home, and he told his wife that night, by the stove, that he did not know what was coming, but that something was coming, and that the widow Vale would either be a great fool by spring or a great deal wiser than the rest of them. His wife asked him which he thought it would be. He said he had watched the dog. He said the dog was not a fool. On the 12th of October, the first real cold came down out of the bighorns. It was not a storm. It was the breath that comes before a storm, the way a man draws air before he speaks. The grass stiffened. The river skinned over at the edges. Hannah Vale stood on the porch in the morning, wrapped in her husband's coat, and she watched Crow. He was not at the north wall. He was at the spring. He had broken the thin ice with his paw, and he was drinking, which he had not done at the spring in 11 days. He drank, and he lifted his head, and he looked east, toward the rising sun, and he did not move for a long time. She watched him. She did not understand what he was telling her. That night, she lay awake, and the child kicked hard against her ribs, and she remembered, suddenly, a thing her husband had said in March, the last spring of his life. He had said that the spring at the draw was warmer than it ought to be, and that he believed there was a fault beneath it, a place where the earth's own heat came nearer the surface than common. He had said that if a man dug a root cellar against the right slope above that spring, he might keep potatoes from freezing in a year that froze cattle in their stalls. He had not dug the cellar. He had died first. She sat up in the dark and she lit the tallow lamp and she went to the almanac. She turned to the back, where her husband had kept his notes, and she found in the entry for the previous March, south face above spring, 2 feet down, frost will not reach. She read it 3 times. In the morning she took the spade and she went to the slope above the spring. Crow came with her. He walked ahead. He walked, she saw now, directly along the line her husband had described. And then he stopped and he sat down, and he looked at the ground beneath him. She knelt and she put her hand to the earth. It was warmer than the earth 10 feet away. Not by much. Enough. She began to dig a second project. She could not dig much. She was 8 months along now, and the weight of the child made bending into the earth a slow and careful business. But she dug an hour a day. She dug a small alcove into the south face of the slope, 2 feet deep, 3 feet wide, 4 feet high. She lined it with the smooth stones from the riverbank, fitted close. She arched the top with willow withes bent and lashed. She covered the hole with sod cut from the high ground and patted into place. When she was finished, on the 3rd of November, she had a chamber the size of a pantry, set into the warm slope above her husband's spring. She placed in it the last of her potatoes, a jar of butter, a wheel of cheese she had been saving, and a smoked ham from the previous winter. She closed the door, a slab of pine she had hung on leather hinges, and she stood back. Crow walked over to the door. He pressed his nose against the seam. He held it there a moment. Then he sat back and looked at her. She took it for approval. She did not know what else to take it for. That night, the wind shifted. It came from the northeast instead of the northwest, and it carried with it the smell of something cold and old. Crow, who had been sleeping at the foot of the bed, rose and went to the door of the cabin and pressed his shoulder against it. He did not whine. He did not bark. He pressed, steady, as if he wanted to be certain the door was true. Then he turned and walked to the north wall, the inside of it, and he lay down with his back against the sod, where the sticks were packed on the other side, and he closed his eyes. She lay awake, and she listened to him breathe. By the morning of the 18th of November, the sky over the Powder had the color of an old pewter cup, and the air had the still, listening quality that means weather coming on a long fetch. Hannah Vale woke at first light with the child low and heavy in her, and she went to the door and opened it, and she stood a moment looking north. The horizon was the color of bruised iron. The cottonwoods by the river were already creaking, though there was no wind yet at the cabin. The stillness was the worst sign. Crow was not at the door. She found him at the north wall, walking the line of the packed sticks one final time, nose to the ground, ear cocked. He worked his way from the east corner to the west, and at the west corner he stopped, and he scratched at a single place near the foundation. She came over to him and she knelt, and she looked. There was a thin seam in the sod where the wall met the ground, a place where the chinking had pulled away, no wider than her finger. She had missed it. She went into the cabin, and she took down the bucket, and she walked to the river. The river was iron at the edges and slow at the middle, and the bank was already crusted with the first true frost. She knelt by the water, slowly, with both hands braced, and she filled the bucket with the dark river mud that lay beneath the lip of the bank. It was the cold and clinging mud of late autumn, heavy with silt, and it would freeze hard as stone once it set. She had watched her husband use it once, to patch a chimney. She remembered the way he had worked it, not too wet, not too dry, smoothed with the flat of the hand and pressed firm into every crack. She carried the bucket back. She was slower than she had been in June. The child rode low. Crow walked beside her. She worked the mud into the seam at the foot of the wall. She worked it into the place where the chinking had pulled. She worked it along every joint she could find, and when she had emptied one bucket, she went back for another. She made 6 trips to the river that day. By the time the sun went down, though there was no sun, only a paler gray behind the gray, she had sealed every seam on the north wall, the east wall, and half the west. She did not stop at dusk. She lit a lantern. She kept working. The wind came up at full dark. It came from the north, just as Crow had said it would, and it came hard. She felt it first against her back as she knelt at the west wall, packing mud into a crack she had only just seen by lantern light. She felt it pull at her shawl. She felt it press the lantern flame flat against the glass. She heard in it the long, low note that a frontier woman learns to fear. Not a howl, not a shriek, but a steady, deep sound like a held breath that does not end. She kept working. By midnight she was on the roof. She had set a ladder against the eaves and she had climbed it. Slowly, with the child, a stone inside her, and Crow watching from below. And she had brought up 2 buckets of river mud on a rope. The roof was sod, and the sod was old, and there were places where she could feel, with her bare hand, the cold air finding its way down through the cracks. She worked along the ridge first. She worked from north to south, packing the mud into every seam, smoothing it with the flat of her hand the way her husband had done at the chimney. The wind tore at her shawl. The lantern, lashed to the ladder below, swung in the gusts. She could no longer feel her fingers. She kept working. She did not know then that this was the work that would save her life. She knew only that the dog had told her there was a seam she had missed, and that her husband had told her, in his quiet way, through the margins of an almanac, that a north wall and a roof were the first things a storm came for. She finished the ridge at what she guessed was 1 in the morning. She came down the ladder a rung at a time, holding the rope with one hand and the rung with the other, and Crow met her at the bottom and pressed his head against her thigh. She went inside. She bolted the door. She banked the fire. She lay down on the bed without taking off her boots, and she fell asleep with one hand on her belly and the other on the dog's back. She did not hear the storm arrive at sunrise. She slept through its first hour. When she woke, the cabin was dark, darker than dawn, and the wind was a wall of sound against the north side of the house. The lantern she had left burning on the table cast a small circle of light, and in that circle she could see her own breath. She could not see the windows. They had been buried in the night. Crow was standing at the door, ears forward, body still. He was not afraid. He was listening. She rose slow, and she went to the small east window, the only window not on the north or the buried side, and she scratched at the rime of frost on the inside of the glass. She put her eye to the place she had cleared. She saw a white world. She saw nothing else. The snow was already to the eaves on the east. She could not imagine what it was on the north. The wind, though, was the thing. The wind was not a wind anymore. It was a presence. It pressed against the north wall of the cabin, and the cabin did not move. It pressed against the roof, and the roof did not give. She could hear, through the sod, the long sustained note of the storm, running itself out across a country that had nothing else to stop it for 100 miles. She could hear the cottonwoods by the river bending and snapping. She could hear, once, a long crack that might have been a tree falling. She could not hear anywhere the sound of her wall failing. She put her hand against the north wall. It was cold, but it was dry. The mud she had packed at midnight had frozen into the seams. The sticks Crow had laid had broken the wind. The chaff she had packed between them had stopped the cold. The swale, which would have funneled the drift against a bare wall and crushed it inward by morning, was now funneling it against a packed bulwark 4 feet deep and frozen solid as masonry. The drift was building the wall stronger, not weaker. She stood there a long moment with her hand on the sod, and she understood, in the way that a person understands a thing without being able to say it, that she was not going to die today. The child kicked. She put her other hand on her belly. Crow came and pressed against her leg. She did not cry. She had cried enough in June. She made coffee. She fed the dog. She fed the fire. She sat at the small pine table with her husband's almanac open before her, and she read his marginal notes in the November pages by the light of the tallow lamp. And outside the storm went on, and inside the cabin held. It held for 3 days. On the second day, in the afternoon, she heard something through the wind that should not have been there. It was not the wall. It was not a tree. It was a voice, a human voice, far off, calling. She went to the door. She did not open it. She listened. The voice came again, thin, exhausted, somewhere to the east. She could not make out words. She could make out only that it was a woman. Crow was at the door. His ears were forward. He was not afraid. There was no other word. He was waiting. She thought a long moment. Then she lifted the bolt. The door blew open against her, and the cold came in like a hand, and she pushed her shoulder against the door and got it half closed, and she called out into the white. She called twice. There was no answer. She thought, perhaps, she had imagined it. She began to push the door shut. Crow went past her. He went past her so fast she could not have stopped him if she had tried. He was out into the storm before she had fully understood that he had moved, and the door slammed back against the wall, and the snow came in over the threshold in a low white wave, and she stood there with one hand on the jamb and the child low inside her, and her shawl whipping at her shoulders. She called the dog. He did not come. She waited at the open door. She did not know what else to do. She could not go after him. She could not close the door against him. She stood and she called, and the wind took her voice away from her almost before it left her mouth, and the cold came up her sleeves and down her collar and into her boots. She did not know, for a long time, whether he was coming back. She did not know, in those minutes at the open door, whether trusting an animal had been the wisest thing she had done in her life, or the last thing. She would not know for another quarter of an hour. She would have to wait, while the child turned, and the lamp guttered, and the snow built on the threshold, and the wind shaped the world outside into a place she could not see. He came back at the edge of the white. She saw him first as a darker shape in the dark of the storm, a low, moving thing, pushing through drift that was higher than his shoulder. He was not alone. Behind him, half stumbling, half carried by the wind, came a woman. The woman was wrapped in a man's coat. She was holding something against her chest. Crow led her, and the woman followed. And at the threshold the dog turned and looked back at Hannah Vale as if to say, "I told you. I have been telling you." Hannah pulled the woman inside. She bolted the door. She turned, and she got the woman to the fire, and she took from her the thing she had been carrying. It was a child, a boy, perhaps 2 years old. He was breathing. He was very cold, but he was breathing. The woman was Mrs. Trumbull, the wife of Asa Trumbull, who had laughed about the widow who took her instructions from a dog. The Trumbull cabin lay 1.5 miles to the northeast. It had gone down in the night, the woman said when she could speak. The roof had given. The north wall had buckled inward under the drift. The chimney had come down through the parlor. Asa had told her to stay. He had told her he would find a way through to Holloway's, 3 miles south, and bring help. He had not come back. She had waited as long as she could with the boy. When the cold began to take him, she had wrapped him in her husband's coat, and she had walked out into the storm, because to stay was certain and to walk was only probable. She had been walking, she thought, for an hour. She did not know in what direction. She had heard, somewhere in the white, the bark of a dog. She had followed it. Hannah did not say anything for a long time. She got the child wrapped in dry wool by the fire. She got the woman wrapped in a blanket beside him. She heated milk. She put the cup in the woman's hands and watched her drink. The woman cried, then, the way a person cries when she has been holding it for a very long time. Hannah did not say anything about Asa Trumbull. There was nothing yet to say. Crow lay down between the woman and the door, and he closed his eyes, and he slept for the first time in 2 days. The storm went on for another full day. The cabin held. The food held. The mud-sealed roof did not leak a single drop, even when the wind shifted south on the third evening and the drift began to slump. By the morning of the fourth day, the wind had broken, and the sky to the east showed a thin band of pale, clean blue, and Hannah Vale opened her door upon a world utterly remade in white. Holloway found them at noon. He had broken trail from the south with 2 horses and a sled. He had been trying to reach the Trumbull place for a day and a half, and he had found it as Mrs. Trumbull had described, collapsed, empty, the chimney down. He had followed a track in the snow that should not have been there, a track of small paw prints almost filled in, and he had followed it back toward Hannah Vale's cabin because he could think of nowhere else it might lead. He brought on his sled the body of Asa Trumbull. He had found him a quarter-mile from Holloway's own barn, frozen at the foot of a fence post, his hands still holding the wire. He had not made it through. Hannah Vale stood on her porch in her husband's coat, and she watched Holloway unload what he had brought, and she did not speak. Mrs. Trumbull, behind her, made a sound that was not quite a word. The boy was inside, asleep by the fire, alive. Holloway took off his hat. He looked at the north wall of Hannah's cabin, at the drift packed against it, at the sticks that showed through here and there, at the line of frozen mud that ran along the eaves. He looked at the dog sitting by the door. He looked a long moment. He did not say anything either. He did not need to. In Bitter Fork, by the end of that week, the story had begun to change. Asa Trumbull was buried on the Friday. The Reverend Pell preached the sermon. He did not mention the widow Vale by name. He spoke, instead, of the strange ways in which Providence prepares some houses and not others. And he looked, while he spoke, at the floor of the church, and he did not look at his congregation. The congregation understood. The Reverend Pell did not ride out to inquire after Hannah Vale's soul again that winter, nor the next. Mrs. Trumbull stayed at the Vale cabin for 11 days. She helped Hannah through the early labor when it came, 2 weeks before its time, and she held Hannah's hand through the night, and she was the first to hold the child, a girl, small and angry and alive, when the morning came. She named her own boy's life as the debt and Hannah's daughter as the gift, and she said, quiet, before she left, that she had been one of the women at the well who had stopped speaking to Hannah Vale in July. She said she was sorry. Hannah said that the cold had taken enough. There was no need for it to take anything else. Mrs. Trumbull went home in the second week of December, to a cabin Holloway, and 3 other men had begun to rebuild for her, and she took her son, and she took a jar of preserves, and she did not ride out again that winter without first looking, from her porch, toward the rise above the Powder, where a thin line of smoke ran straight up into the cold blue sky. Spring came late that year. It came in the last week of April, in a thaw that broke the river open in a single afternoon, and Hannah Vale stood on her porch with her daughter wrapped against her chest, and she watched the ice go out. Crow lay on the warm boards at her feet. He was older, that spring. The winter had aged him. He slept more. He no longer carried sticks to the north wall, because the north wall did not need them anymore. The drift had packed it so hard that the sod beneath had set into the shape of the wind, and would hold against any storm for years to come. She watched him in the spring light. The river. He was not warning her of anything. He was not telling her anything. He was only a dog on a warm board in the sun. She understood then what she had not been able to understand in November. She understood that the dog had not been wise. He had only been a dog, doing what dogs do, following the small old instincts that had been bred into his bones by 10,000 winters before hers. The wisdom had not been his. The wisdom had been in the watching of him. The wisdom had been in her willingness to set down her own certainty and pick up his. She thought of her husband, who had written in the margin of an almanac, "Watch the dog, watch the spring, watch the swale." She thought he had not been telling her about a dog or a spring or a swale. He had been telling her about attention. He had been telling her how to live in a country that did not care whether she lived in it, and that would teach her, if she let it, through the small, unflashy lessons of the creatures who had been here longer. She bent, slow, and she put her hand on Crow's head. He opened one eye. He closed it again. On the frontier, wisdom sometimes walked on 4 legs and asked nothing in return except to be believed. If this story stayed with you, there is another waiting by the same quiet fire.